Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're discussing the MBE portion of the bar exam, which causes a lot of stress for people studying for and taking the bar. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Careers site. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about how to conquer the bar exam, specifically the MBE. Taking 6 hours of multiple choice questions is challenging for just about everyone, but for some people, it can really be a major speed bump on the road to bar exam success. For those of you who might not know what the MBE is, Lee, could you give them a little bit of a rundown?
For sure. So the MBE is a 6-hour multiple choice test given on the Wednesday session of the bar exam, which is given twice a year in late February and late July. The MBE tests 7 subjects. If you're a 1L, many of these subjects may sound kind of familiar to you. Con law, criminal law and procedure, civil procedure, contracts, evidence, property, and torts. There are 200 questions on the MBE. About 190 of them are graded. 10 of them are where they float the questions out there to get feedback. And these 200 questions are given in 2 3-hour blocks. Every state but Louisiana uses the MBE exam as part of their bar exam. So pretty much if you're listening to this podcast, you at some point in your legal career are going to take the MBE.
I mean, it sounds to me like maybe they should just give this right after your 1L year, right?
I know. It does feel that way. Or maybe part of your final exams, who knows? But yeah, it definitely has a lot to do. It happens, your first year and then sometimes that first part of your second year.
Yeah, or I guess evidence you can usually take whenever. Like I know I took evidence my last semester as a 3L, mostly so that I didn't have to restudy it for the bar.
Which is pretty wise, yeah.
Yeah, it was recommended highly that was a good thing to do. So I took that to heart, and pretty much everyone else in the class was doing the same thing.
Yeah. So why is the MBE so challenging? Because for a lot of people, this is a huge point of stress where it comes from studying for the bar.
I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but I would say number one is it's just a really hard test.
It is a really hard test.
I mean, like I'm someone who's basically got through life on multiple choice, being good at multiple choice tests, and I found this to be a really difficult exam. I didn't really study for the LSAT. I didn't really study for the SAT. I mean, you can all hate me now, but I'm just not. I didn't study really for the GRE, and I did fine on all those. So I remember sort of walking into the first time I sat down to take these MBE questions, I was like, oh yeah, no problem. I'm good at standardized tests, and I was like, good Lord. Like, I have no idea what the right answer is here.
Yeah. I remember taking some practice ones and just reading the answer choices and being like, I mean, it's one of these. That was like my thought. It's one of these.
Yeah, I just remember like, well, it's got to be here somewhere, right?
Yeah, it's brutal. I mean, it really is brutal. And I think it's brutal for a number of reasons. But the other reason I think it's brutal is the law doesn't actually lend itself to the multiple choice format.
Right, exactly. It's like you go through law school and every answer is it depends. And suddenly you get to the MBE and it's like, oh no, you have to pick one.
And I actually remember before I went into the test room on the second day of the bar to take the MBE, my dad sent me a text and said, just remember the answers at least on the page. And I was like, yeah, but there are so many answers on the page. Right.
Exactly. It could be any of them. I mean,
exactly.
Flip a coin. Well, I mean, for me, like I think usually, typically you can sort of eliminate like one or two, but then oftentimes you're not even choosing like the right answer, objectively speaking. You're choosing either the least bad answer or the best of two pretty good answers.
Yeah. And that is problematic for a lot of reasons. But one is, over the years, most of us have learned tricks to take standardized tests. I mean, I used to tutor for the SAT and, there are all the tricks about eliminating the answer choices, or going through and evaluating them certain ways to be faster. I mean, all of these tricks that we have learned over the years and years and years. those tricks typically don't work on the MBE because of what Alison just said, is that oftentimes you're not necessarily picking the right answer. You may be picking the best answer or the least wrong answer, or just the answer that seems to be the best fit in some way or another.
Yeah, and I think one place people can really go wrong on this is I find it could actually be really confusing to sort of focus on the answer choices when you're working on the problem. I know sometimes we talk with students and we're like, treat this almost like a mini hypo, like read the question and then try to formulate an answer as if you were going to write an essay before you look at the answer choices. Because if you start, sometimes with these test taking tricks, it's like, read the answer choices first and then read the question. It's like, I think that's an absolute disastrously terrible approach to the MBE.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it is very important to use the kind of fact reading skills and the legal analysis skills that you've done on all of your essay writing and try and apply them to these mini hypos. Basically, all of these MBE questions are mini hypos.
Yeah, but one of the things to keep in mind is they're really testing these narrow exceptions and not a sweeping concept. So maybe you understand negligence, but the MBE question is not going to be about negligence. It's going to be about some very nitpicky detail of assumption of the risk, for example.
Right.
So I think, people who are sort of big picture thinkers are like, yeah, I basically get this. They're going to zero in on those things where it's just like, oh, no, I definitely do not remember this.
Yeah, a question I often talk to my students about is about a doctor being at a restaurant and someone is choking and they don't save that person who's choking. And does the doctor have a duty of care to save the person who's choking?
I think yes, but I'm not 100%
Actually,
sure.
I think it is no. See, this is what we're talking about.
It could be either.
It could be either. But it depends.
I could make a policy argument for either of those.
Right. I think
what is the actual black letter law in the MBE? We would have to look it up.
Yeah, exactly. Luckily, we're not taking the bar in just a few weeks. But, that's a very nuanced question about negligence. And let's be honest, Alison and I know a lot of torts. We talk a lot of torts with a lot of people, but that's a very nuanced rule. And that's the kind of hair splitting that they're doing.
Yeah, because I'm thinking no, this is a different type of duty because the doctor is a professional. The professional has a duty. But then I'm thinking, am I actually confusing that with the duty to continue rendering aid if you start rendering aid?
Right.
There are all these really small nuances.
Yes. Another place that the nuances get crazy on the MBE, character evidence, in evidence, when you can present character evidence, when you cannot.
God.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, for
the types
what?
of character evidence, oh my gosh, just makes your head spin.
And those are, that's pretty sophisticated because you've got to understand, why is someone bringing this in? Is it actually hearsay? They love to lead people down these sort of faux hearsay paths and things like that.
Oh, and let's not even start talking about the rule against perpetuities. Oh my goodness.
Well, luckily with that, you're going to get one question, maybe two.
Yeah, and mortgages.
I feel like the evidence ones could just go on and on.
That's true, but mortgages, you could really... my memory
and
my
recording statutes and all that stuff. Oh,
I really felt like half of my MBE was on mortgages and recording statutes. I realized that's statistically not possible, but it sure felt that way.
Yeah, the ones that I always got wrong because I had this insane professor were the search and seizure, Fourth Amendment ones.
Oh, see, I rocked those.
Yeah, you would because, you actually had background in this. I had an insane woman who's now actually a federal judge who thought that basically the police could and should be able to do anything.
Oh.
Yeah, and you realize when you study for the MBE, you're like, oh no, there are a lot of rules about what they're actually allowed to do, and you have to memorize. And so it's the sort of thing where we will talk about this later, how to study. But I literally missed every single one of these questions for weeks on end until finally I'd seen it enough times where I was like, oh, this is my instinct. However, I know my instinct is wrong, so I'm not going to pick that. I'm going to look at the other choices.
Yeah. And I think, if you're in law school and you're listening to this, it's possible that your professors are starting to incorporate multiple choice into your final exams, which I don't think is a terrible idea, that you get a little bit comfortable with these types of questions. But, if you get the opportunity to use multiple choice practice either to study or to review the law in law school, it's going to help you out down the road when you get this huge, it's basically the biggest final exam you've ever taken.
Right, with really high stakes.
With really, really high stakes. And that is, I think, one of the other hard things about the MBE is it, depending on your jurisdiction, it's a huge part of your score, and the stakes are very high. If you fail, you have to wait until the next administration of the exam. We were just talking earlier today about how expensive it is to sit for this exam every time you take it. This is not a test to be taken lightly. This is a test you must take very seriously. We don't think you need to be crazy about it, but you have to take it seriously because my favorite motto is one and done. You don't want to have to do it again if it's avoidable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the reality is just there's a lot of law to learn. There's a lot of nuance here. You have to practice. We'll talk about the details of that later. But, and frankly, for a lot of people, they just don't think that they're very good at multiple choice or that they've historically been that great at multiple choice. And I think that can lead to a lot of anxiety. And also, the reality is just the time pressure here is really intense.
Yeah, it's really intense. You just have a little over 2 minutes to do every question, which when you crack open the books and see how long just the prompt for the question is, that's not that much time. And so if you are a slow reader or somebody who can take tests kind of slowly, that can really, really be difficult. I think stamina is also a huge issue. 3 hours of multiple choice at one sitting is brutal.
Absolutely. Brutal. And then you grab lunch and you come back and you do it all again.
Yeah. And I think the additional parts of this that is brutal is actually to pass, because they do curve the MBE, you're probably getting pretty poor scores.
Oh yeah, like objectively speaking. On a scale of 1 to 100. I mean, what is, I don't know, like 60, 70%?
Yeah, it's between 60 and 70% typically is a passing score on the MBE. And so when you think about that, for most of us, if we were taking a final exam in law school and we were pulling 60, 65% of them right, we would be really worried.
Yeah, you would basically probably be receiving a failing grade.
Exactly. And so that really mentally messes with you. I mean, for me personally, I remember taking the MBE in the morning session, and I really did feel like the entire first half of those questions were all on mortgages, which I didn't really know anything about, or felt that I didn't know anything about. And I went back to my hotel room and I texted my now husband, and just the text I think said, "I think I just failed the bar." Of course, he called me back because he was a little worried. And he's like, "What happened?" And I'm like, I felt okay after the first day, but I'm pretty sure things have gone south. And I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to lose my job. And this is what you do. You go down the road.
Down that path.
I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to pass. What are we going to do? I don't know what I'm going to spend my time doing. I turned on the HBO and it was Happy Feet, like playing on repeat in HBO in my hotel room. I'm watching Happy Feet, like not sure what's going on. It's so easy to really spin yourself into a place of anxiety and questioning yourself, because the stakes are high and it's set up to make you feel like you're failing. And I probably was, quote unquote, failing from my own standards, but I was passing the test.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a similar story, although I took the Massachusetts bar when my first bar exam, and the first day of that is the MBE. Ooh. So it was horrible. So most of my friends were taking New York, so they had done the New York essays the day before, and then they did the MBE and they were finished. And like at that point, they didn't care. They were just like, whatever. So I remember being on GChat or something with a good friend of mine from law school who just set for New York, and he's out drinking, and I'm like back in my house, like preparing for the next day. And I was just like, there is no way I didn't fail that. Mm-hmm. Like, there is just no way. Like, that was so brutal and so horrible. Like, I had to have failed that test. And he's just like, look, you were law review at Columbia. You studied for this. You did not fail. I was like, no, I failed. And I started going through every question that I could remember that I was sure I'd gotten wrong. And after like 5 of them, he was like, okay, are there any others? And I'm like, well, those are the ones that I'm pretty sure I definitely got wrong. So I'm pretty sure I failed. He's like, that's like 5 questions out of 200. They were probably not even the real ones because they were completely insane. And were probably like the ones they're testing that they'll never even use. Like, could you please calm down and go to sleep and like go take the second day of the test? But I mean, that's what happens. Nobody, I don't think anybody walks out of that day of the exam feeling good about it.
Well, if you did, you probably missed the boat and you didn't even realize how hard it was. So I think that's...
Yeah, I mean, like extremely high achieving people walk out in tears. Yeah. It's just the way it is.
Exactly. And so, that makes studying for it, as we're going to transition to studying for it, very difficult too, because even studying for it, you're not going to perform particularly well. And that can also be very frustrating and very emotionally challenging. So it's very important to understand this test and to understand, what is required of you so you can study, in a very targeted way to do the best that you can. So
I think with reasonable expectations, yes. A reasonable expectation is not to be getting like 90 or 95% of these right.
Nope.
You could give, any law review or like law school professor in the country these questions, and they're not going to get all of them right. And you could put 10 of them in a room and they're not going to always agree on the answers.
Yeah. And, even now it's interesting how if a student sends me a question because they're doing practice and they're struggling with it, and if I read it too fast and don't carefully, thoughtfully read it, I will get it wrong. And I do this for a living. That doesn't mean that I'm not good at what I do. It just means that this stuff is complicated. And then I kind of say, oh, stop, Lee, sit and really read it carefully. Read the facts carefully, because you get these questions and you're like, oh, I'll just read the paragraph. You can't just think about it that way. You've got to be very methodical about it.
Yeah, they also, they're fond of certain misdirections and things that you'll see over and over once you start doing a lot of these, which is why you need to do a lot.
Yep.
But, they love the sort of they'll give you something that seems right if you're not really thinking carefully, and you just pick that and move on. And if you do that enough, things are not going to go well.
Exactly. All right, so now I think we've probably convinced everyone that they actually have to study for this test.
Hopefully. If you're out listening to this, trust me, I'm really good at this. You still have to study.
Exactly. But now, how do we think people should be studying for the MBE?
Well, I think one of the mistakes people make is that they sort of passively listen to lectures on a topic, say evidence. You're like, oh, great, I've got my bar review course and it's got 10 hours of essay, or 10 hours of stuff. I'll speed it up. I'll do 7, Okay, great. I'm good for the MBE. I know this stuff, but that's not really what you need to be doing here. I think practicing these questions is just the only way that you can learn this material in a way that's useful for the MBE.
Yeah, I mean, like Alison said, she had just taken evidence before bar prep. If you have just taken evidence before bar prep, if there's time to not listen to 10 hours of evidence lectures, that might be a good use of your time.
No, I would say basically sit down and do 30 questions in evidence. And if you get 80% of them right, move on with your life.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is it's if you spent those, 7+ hours doing multiple choice practice on evidence, would that get you closer to your goals? That's what you have to ask yourself. So, doing the practice is so critical, and not just doing it. Sometimes the mistake we see with students is they just say, oh, well, I'm going to do a set of 30 questions. Oops, I got half of them wrong. Oh, well, yeah, that's not a good approach. You have to do the questions and then you have to study them. If you got it right, did you get it right for the right reasons, or were you lucky? Because luck isn't going to help you on exam day. So, you got to make sure that you did understand the nuance, because sometimes you can get it right for the wrong reasons. And then when you get something wrong, you better understand why you got it wrong. Was it a weak knowledge of the law? If so, that's fixable. Go learn that law. Or was it that you didn't read the facts carefully enough? Were you reading too quickly? Guys, this is not a time to be very, oh, well, I can get through these questions without, having to underline things, and I can do my questions in half the time. Literally sitting down, if you're taking them on paper, and underlining things. Or I'm even a big fan of taking the scratch paper and covering the lines like you're in elementary school, no joke, to slow yourself down. You've got to try and do these things because you need to figure out why you're missing these questions and play with different ways that you can try and keep yourself from going into bad habits. The only way you can do that is by evaluating what went wrong and then trying different solutions to fix it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's a great idea is if, as soon as you miss an area of law, you miss a nuance, you don't know whether the doctor has a duty or not, write that down.
Yeah.
You should have a master file that basically is either questions that you need to find answers to or things that you did not know. Mm-hmm. Because you want to be reviewing that. Because, the reality is, for most people, after you've sort of done a basic review of the law of these areas, you probably know a lot of it. But there are these things you're not going to know, and that's what you really need to focus on.
And I've had students do these kind of banks of problem areas in lots of different ways. Some students keep a legal pad, and each sheet is a different subject, and then they write down the rule that they missed on the legal pad, or a journal, or an Excel spreadsheet, whatever floats your boat.
Whatever, Evernote, who cares?
Exactly.
Trello. You could have an amazing Trello board that you set up for each topic area that, you add a new card for each thing that you don't know. Whatever it is that works for you. Those are, just do something. Don't just be oh, whoops, got that wrong, moving on.
Yeah, that Trello board idea, though, we should do a blog post about that. I'll put that on my list. That's a good idea.
Yeah, using Trello for your bar study could be so amazing.
Yes. Okay, so you've got to figure out what went wrong. And you also have to evaluate, maybe what questions you're using to practice. I mean, if you're taking a commercial bar course like Barbary, Kaplan, Themis, BarMax, the list goes on, you likely have an MBE module. They're giving you questions. They've got different ways for you to study for the MBE. There are different schools of thoughts on who's better writing questions, Barbary, Kaplan, like Themis, whatever. The reality is, I would make sure that whatever you're using to study uses at least the majority of the released questions from the National Conference of Bar Examiners. So you are taking retired questions. I think those are very important to review. And if you have access to a few different questions, either from different books or different bar providers, mix it up. Because if you only take questions from Barbary, their questions are going to be in a slightly different style than Kaplan's questions, or Emmanuel's Strategies and Tactics, which is a book you can buy on Amazon. It's good to have a variety, because everyone will tell you when they sit down to the test that the test questions were slightly different than whatever questions they did for practice.
Yeah, and part of that is probably just like you've seen a lot of the practice questions, once or twice before you get there. But I think that's a great idea. I mean, what are some other tools people might consider? So
one of the tools that we like is Adaptabar. You guys might have heard us talk about this on the podcast, and they were even kind enough to sponsor a previous podcast episode.
That's not why we're talking about them.
That's not why we're talking about them, because I've been recommending them for years and years before they even started supporting us. But the reason we like it is, one, they do use the past released questions from the National Conference of Bar Examiners. And then they have this kind of back-end algorithms that really help you practice weak areas. And so they take out a little bit of the guesswork for you because you don't have to necessarily track the types of questions you're missing. They're doing it, and then their computer magically forces you to take more types of those questions. Now, that's a very non-technical explanation. And Alison, is there a better explanation for that than what I just described, since you are the technical mind?
Well, I think that's pretty much it. But I'll just say, I actually studied way back in the day before Adaptabar even existed. I studied with a program like this because I only had 2 weeks to study for the entire Massachusetts bar exam, because I was working over the summer and just didn't get started on it. So I basically started studying in earnest kind of after the 4th of July, and had this, moment of okay, what am I going to do? And on the MBE, I had a similar program. It was very cutting edge at that point. But it, did 100 questions, saw what you're getting right, saw what you're getting wrong, and didn't really give you the questions you were getting right, because why bother? Mm-hmm. The downside of this approach, it's extremely effective. It's extremely efficient. The downside is it's also brutal. Because all you're basically getting are the questions that you're getting wrong consistently. Mm-hmm. And for me, like I said, it was all the Fourth Amendment questions. I just had no idea on search and seizure. And it took a little while for that reality to sink in, but they just kept giving them to me, and I kept missing them until I finally, spent half of a day really focusing on this. But the upside of that is, if I had just been doing, assorted questions, it might not have become obvious to me that I really just had absolutely no idea on this.
Yeah.
So I think, you have to focus on your weak areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And if you really, if you can't, invest in a tool like Adaptabar, another option that you can try is the National Conference of Bar Examiners. You can actually purchase old tests and take them online as well. That is a bit of a lower price point. And that's another way to practice with the released questions. I know closer to the exam, sometimes students use those as 3-hour practice exams. So, there are lots of things that you can do, but Alison's right. Doing what you're not good at is going to make you uncomfortable, but doing what you're good at doesn't get you any closer to passing. Obviously somebody could construct their own spreadsheet where they really drill down into okay, I missed 10 out of these 30 questions I just did. What is the category? What's the big area? Am I in contracts? Am I in property? Am I in evidence? But then also what's the actual issue here? And isn't there a list somewhere about the topics that are tested? Oh, yes, there is. And it's actually free. One of the few things in the bar world that's actually free. So we have linked this in the show notes, but the National Conference of Bar Examiners are nice enough to release a subject matter outline that lists all of the possible topics that can be tested on. And they also give you a ballpark of what the breakdown within that given subject is, about how many of those questions you're going to see on a given topic. So if you really want to be strategic about this, you can print out this outline for free. You can go in with a highlighter and pretty much get a really good idea of what the majority of the questions are going to be on.
I recall doing this. I recall basically my idea was like, I'll print it out. I'll see if there's anything on there that I've never seen before. And if so, I'll like look that up. But most of it's like, okay, I pretty much get this. And so then, you could almost use that outline when you're trying to figure out what you don't know, go through that outline and mark off ticks of like, okay, I missed this, I missed this, I missed this. I think it would pretty rapidly become apparent what your weak and strong points are.
For sure. And, if you notice that a large chunk of the evidence questions happen to be on hearsay exceptions, and if you're pretty weak on hearsay exceptions, well, then you better sit down and start studying some hearsay exceptions because
Yeah, absolutely. You better know all, 18 of them or whatever it is, not just like, oh yeah, I kind of get the hearsay is like a statement of out-of-court declarant. Okay, no, it's like you need to know the details of it.
Right, exactly. Like what qualifies as a statement? Is assertive conduct a statement? When is it a statement? When is something a non-hearsay? Like all these details. But they tell you what's going to be tested. I had no idea these subject matter outlines existed when I was studying for the bar because nobody told me about them. The bar providers don't tell you about them, which I think is silly, but you can do this right now. Go click on it. One thing I will say is that since there are going to be people down the road that listen to this much later than after we recorded it, I did see on the National Conference of Bar Examiners website that there are going to be new outlines released in early 2017 because they're slightly changing real property in February of 2017. So if you're listening to this in 2017, make sure you are getting the updated outlines for 2017.
Yeah, I think that's a good piece of advice in any case. Make sure you're studying the right stuff.
Yeah.
For example, until recently, the MBE did not include CivPro.
Yeah.
So if you have a set of old books from your friend who took the exam 3 years ago, you need to double check that.
Yep. Okay, so we've talked about our outlines. What about kind of like time management and this issue of dealing with time? I mean, sure, you can take sets of 33 questions, which is about an hour, but unfortunately, you do need to sit down and take some 3-hour timed practice. It's really the only way to see where you are and to get comfortable with this undertaking of doing these 100 questions. I see a lot of students struggle with focusing, and let's be honest, I struggled with focusing on multiple choice for 3 hours. It is a grind. It really is. And you need to practice it to see if there are any coping mechanisms that are going to make it easier. So, for instance, I have some students who, if you take enough 3-hour practice tests, you're going to notice that maybe at certain points you miss strings of questions. You might miss 5 in a row. And that might almost always happen after the first hour. Well, that probably means that you are losing focus. You're getting too tired. And so my recommendation would be stop around an hour, look up, stretch, do some breathing exercises, repeat some positive mantras, walk up, go get a drink of water. I don't really care what you do. I'm a big fan
have a sip of, whatever caffeine drink they let you imbibe, if any.
If any. Most bars won't even let you have any liquids in the bar room. But, I'm a big fan of walking to the bathroom and washing my hands. That was what I did. I don't know why.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, people think, oh, there's no possible way I could get up in a 3-hour test. It's it actually, if you get up and walk quickly to the bathroom, use the bathroom, have a sip of water, throw some water on your face and walk back, we're talking a few minutes max. If that then increases your focus 80% for the next hour, it's totally worth it.
Exactly. And the only way that you figure out if you need this stuff is by practicing. And, Alison made a good point of taking, sips of your caffeine drink or whatever. It's important to find out what the bar is going to allow you to have in the room. Because if you're not allowed to have water, if you're not allowed to have caffeine drinks, if you're not allowed to have snacks, the list goes on and on and on, you better be taking these practice tests without these comforts.
Oh yeah, exactly. You're sitting there with your donut and your cup of coffee.
Yeah.
It's not going to be like that.
No, it's really funny, now that I hang out with kids and toddlers, which I never used to do, kids and toddlers love to have whatever their one precious thing is that they're going to hold on to for dear life for that outing. And you kind of think well, that's kind of silly. And then you realize how many of us have those objects. Many of it's our phone, but we've always got something in our hands, some sort of comfort thing that we have. No checking your email during a 3-hour practice test, no reading texts. You really have to be comfortable being in this exam mode. It's very important to
and people
this.
might consider, as they get closer to the test date, I mean, think about it, you're not going to be alone in your room. You might consider going to Starbucks for a few hours and doing these set of tests, because that's that's closer to what your exam environment's going to be like. There are going to be distractions. You might be wearing earplugs, which you're not used to doing. You want to try to replicate the exam experience as well as you can. I mean, particularly if you have any sort of like anxiety about testing and that kind of thing, the best way to get over that, or one of the ways, is just to really expose yourself to that stimulus as much as you can beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And to practice what you're going to do when you start to freak out. If you're someone who has anxiety and that you're sitting in the room, and that if you feel like you get 3 or 4 questions in a row that are just complete head scratchers, and that's going to send you over the edge.
Or like when that test shows up on your desk and you open it and you have you start to like not be able to focus, or you're like, oh my God, I can't breathe,
Right. What are you going to do? Because the thing is, you got to have a plan. And that plan, by our friends who are experts in the field, is typically to have some sort of breathing technique, have some sort of coping mechanism that you have practiced throughout your bar prep, so you can call on it at the time and get it together.
And it becomes almost second nature.
Yes, exactly.
You're not thinking about what to do. You just immediately go to your tactical breathing.
Mm-hmm. You go to your tactical breathing, you do your visualization, you close your eyes, you count, like whatever it might be. You need to have a plan, and it needs to be second nature.
Apparently doing math is actually a great distraction in your head.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, apparently it's a really good way to make yourself not cry, is to start doing math problems. So I can see it also working for anxiety, because it just distracts you and you think about something else.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if it just also uses a completely different part of your brain.
Yeah, exactly. It just like switches something.
Yeah. Well, it's really fascinating. The other thing is an old trick from my SAT tutoring days, is sometimes in the morning before the exam, students want to take practice questions to quiz themselves. And I would, that's a terrible idea. But what is interesting advice that I got from the owners of my SAT prep company that I actually think can be wise is reading, yet not taking questions before you walk into the room. So over breakfast, you're drinking coffee only. So the first thing that you read in the morning, it's not question number 1.
Yeah, I can see that. You want to get your brain like in a good place of focus. So you're sort of excited, you're ready to go, you're ready to knock this test out of the park, get rid of it.
Exactly.
And if, there are techniques you can use to do that, I think great. What you do not want to do is demoralize yourself the morning of the test by getting a bunch of stuff wrong.
Exactly. So if you think that's going to demoralize you, even reading it and not evaluating your work, read something else, as long as it's also not going to be upsetting or demoralizing, like the news right now, which I have a really hard time reading and then focusing on whatever I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly. Like you want to, these are things, if something horrible happens in the world the night before your test, like don't read about it. Don't listen to NPR. Like these are,
I know.
I mean, it's sad but true, but you need to focus on getting rid of the bar exam, and then you can go out and save the world.
It's true. It's time to live in a bit of a bubble, because as much as you can, because it can be very distracting. You have to deal with the task at hand.
Yeah. One thing I want to bring up, and people can sort of take or leave this as an idea, but when I had a really interesting podcast with Nathan Fox, who runs Fox LSAT, and one of the things he said to me, which is that he advises his students, because so many people have like such time management issues on the MBE or even on the LSAT, and they're like, I just can't get through all the questions. There's just no way. They spend all this time kind of focusing on like how much time they have left and how much time per question. It can be really distracting. And one of the things he said was he doesn't tell them to try to finish, which I thought was sort of fascinating advice that I really wonder if you can apply to the MBE. I mean, given that, the normal rate that you need to pass is pretty low. Mm-hmm. If you can increase the number of questions you're getting right substantially by just not finishing the test, I'm not saying like do half of them, right. But, like if you say you don't get to the last 10 questions consistently. Well, if you just bubble in C, you're going to get some percentage of those. And if that allows you to increase, say that you were getting 40% right before, and now you can get 70% right, that seems like something you should experiment with.
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting idea, and I could see this being effective for people who have extreme time issues, maybe even folks who have attention deficit issues that can show up when you don't get extended time, that maybe you need a little bit more of a buffer, but I think it's an interesting mathematical exercise to try and think through,
Okay, so how much better do you have to be doing to just be able to leave some of them off? Exactly.
And I think sometimes, it's really what you make of the opportunity to sit for those 100 questions. It's not about, nobody will know if you finish the test. It's just all about how many you get right.
Exactly. So I just thought that was an interesting point. That so if somebody's really struggling and feeling like a lot of time pressure, it might be worth doing a set or two of 100 questions and just not, obviously move through as rapidly as possible, but stop worrying about the timing and see if you're getting a lot more right.
Yeah, it would really be interesting. So something to think about if you're really up against a wall with the timing. The other thing students often ask me is like, where's the danger zone? Where should they be really worried? And that's always a tough question. But if you are, let's say, halfway through your bar prep, you've been studying all the MBE subjects, and you are not, and you're getting like 40 to 50% of them right consistently, and that's
I would say serious red flag.
Serious red flag. It is time to open up your mind about different ways that you can prep. So it could be talking to an MBE expert, hiring a tutor, trying a different tool. Something needs to happen. But those aren't scores that you can come back from. I don't want to be harsh, but that's just where we are.
You're digging yourself such a hole
that
there's just absolutely no way that you can make that up on the essays.
Yep.
And the flip side of that is, the only reason I passed the bar is the MBE. So, if you're getting a substantial percentage of the MBE questions right, if you're consistently getting 80 or 90% of them, you can probably basically stop studying and turn your focus to something else.
But I think what's interesting is depending on your jurisdiction, like in California, which still has this 3-day test for a while at least, the MBE is not weighted as heavily as in jurisdictions with 2-day tests. And
Thank God for the performance test.
I know, exactly. But what's interesting about that is, a lot of students get in California can get obsessed with the MBE and forget that it's just, a bit over a third of the rest of the exam. And so you have to really make sure that you are allocating your time around based on what the test is for. If it's 50% of the test, of your entire test, and you're struggling massively with it, it needs some serious time or you just can't dig yourself out of that.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, if somebody, isn't going to do the sort of full 8-week, 10-week prep, and they're really focusing on how do I get the most bang for my buck, I would often argue that doing really well in the MBE, which I think is actually more trainable and faster, can be a decent argument. It's think about all the law you might have to learn for the essays. Well, if you get 80% of the MBE in a state where it's 50% of the test, and you're basically a reasonable writer who's done some studying on the rest, you're probably not going to fail.
Well, especially if your jurisdiction uses the performance test, which you don't need to know any law. Yeah. So that means that you've got the MBE and a good chunk of the essays already basically done before you get to this this short, well, if it's the MBE, it's 30-minute questions. So you really have to think through the test.
And studying for the MBE also basically covers a lot of the topic areas that you're going to see on these essays too.
Yeah. So it's not to be ignored, but it's also to be thoughtful about how you're allocating your time. You shouldn't ignore any part of the test, but if you have to be strategic and if you have to triage, make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck when it comes to your study time.
Absolutely.
And with that, I think we're out of time.
Speaking of time.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. And don't forget, for more bar exam tips, you can check out some prior podcasts and also check out our bar exam site, barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.